Population ecology. Let's start out with the birth rate, also called nativity rate. In this particular example, we're going to be looking at humans, so the number of babies being born in a given time. Some examples here are 23 births per year or 10 births per minute. It doesn't matter if you use year or minute. You can also use weeks. You can use seconds. You can use year. It doesn't matter, but you have a number of births over a particular amount of time. The opposite of birth rate is death rate, also called mortality. So it's the number of individuals that die in a given amount of time. So in this example, we have 73 deaths per hour, or maybe you could say 5 deaths per second. But again, it could be per year, it could be per month, as long as you have a number over a specific amount of time. Immigration with the I and immigration with the E. Immigration with the I are the number of individuals that move into a population. You could think of the immigration with the I represents in, they're moving into an area. Immigration with the E could stand for exit. In other words, it's the number of individuals that move away or they're exiting an area. You cannot have immigration with the I unless you first of all have immigration with the E. The individuals must be exiting one area before they can enter another area. So if you want to know if your population is growing or declining, in other words, getting bigger or smaller, well, you take the number being born and the number coming into an area minus the number who are dying and also the amount who are leaving an area. And if you have a positive number, then your population is growing. If it's a negative number, your population is declining. It's getting smaller. All populations eventually reach equilibrium. You can think of this as an equal. It's an average. In other words, it's not growing or declining. It's somewhere in the middle. And we'll talk about what determines equilibrium in a few minutes here. But it's neither growing or declining. It's kind of found its spot around the average. So what does determine the size of a population? The answer, limiting factors. A limiting factor is something that will prevent the population from growing forever. We have 5 of them that we're going to be looking at in this lesson. Limiting factors could be biotic or abiotic. In the previous lesson, we said that bio means life, so biotic would be living things. Abiotic or non-living things. Remember in Latin, a means without, so without life, abiotic. So limiting factors could be living or non-living factors, biotic or abiotic. All ecosystems have a limited amount of food or water or space to live in or nesting sites or mating and other resources. They're all limited. And the population size depends on the amount of available resources we have and how members of the population can actually use those resources. If the resources become scarce, in other words, you start to run out of them, or if the environment is damaged, then the members of the population will suffer and the population will go down. So what is keeping our human population from growing forever and forever and forever? We're going to talk about 5 major limiting factors that affects all populations, including humans. Let's look at one of them now. First, we're going to talk about our resources like food and water. The United Nations has predicted that water will be the limiting factor for humans, that one day we will simply not have enough water for the population. I have a lot of my students who get confused. So, Mr. West, how could that be? We have a lot of water. We have most of the planet's covered with water. The problem is most of the water is salt water. You can't drink it. And what fresh water we do have, most of it is frozen and don't have access to that. So, and then we have a little bit of water, fresh water left, and unfortunately some people are polluting that water or wasting the water. So the United Nations believe that water will be the limiting factor for humans, but only time will tell. Limiting factor number 2 is space. And for example, if you were a fish in a pond, well, the size of that pond would determine your population. As if the pond got bigger, you could have a higher population. If the pond got smaller because you're in a drought, then the population would also be smaller. So space. Will humans have enough space to live in if the population continues to grow? Number 3 is predators. So if, for example, you were a fish in that pond and you have some birds coming in trying to eat you, the birds will be one of the factors that would limit your growth. If you have a lot of birds in that area that are eating you, then your population will probably not be very big. But predators are a limiting factor. Disease. As the human population starts to grow and continues to get bigger, humans are living closer together. And when humans live closer together, it's easier for disease to spread from one person to another. That's not just true with humans, it's true for all organisms. As the population density increases and they're closer together, disease becomes a major factor. Limiting factor number 5 is habitat. In the earlier lesson, we said habitat is where you live, it's your place. In this picture, we have a polar bear. The polar bear is not meant to live in a tropical area. So as the planet continues to rise in temperature and the ice melts, the polar bear will lose his habitat. And he is not fit to live in the tropical areas. So this could be the habitat could be the limiting factor for polar bears. Let's look at the ways populations can grow. There are basically 2 different tracks they can take, logistical or exponential. So as we said, exponential growth or logistical. Exponential means you have plenty of food and water and you're going to grow very, very fast. The population increases really fast. Logistical basically means you've reached equilibrium. You're no longer growing, you're not declining, you're not getting smaller, but you're not getting bigger. Over time, all exponential turn into logistical. Over time. Let's look at the exponential growth curve, also called a J-curve. If you look at that red line in the graph and look at the J at the top of the picture, you'll see they look pretty similar, which is why we call it a J-curve. In an exponential growth curve, the reason the population is growing that fast is because we have plenty of food, plenty of water, not a lot of disease, a lot of space to live in, not a lot of predators. And the population is really growing very fast. But eventually, they will run out of something. Maybe they run out of food, or maybe they run out of water, or maybe the population density gets so high that disease kicks in. And when they do, they will no longer be growing at that very fast exponential rate. Instead, they will turn into an S-curve. So as you can see, if you look at the green, the dark green on the picture in the graph, it looks like the letter S. So all J-curves eventually turn into S-curves when they hit a limiting factor. I want to be very clear here that you only have to hit one limiting factor. And whichever one you hit first will turn you into an S-curve, whether it's food or water or shelter or predators or disease. The first limiting factor you have will turn a J curve into an S curve. The number of individuals at that point that it turns into an S curve is called the carrying capacity. In other words, that's the most that you can have in that population for that area. So limiting factors keep the populations from growing forever, and the number of individuals at that point in time is called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the highest number of organisms that an area can hold. And the reason it maxes out is because it runs out of something. In other words, it hits a carrying capacity. It hits a limiting factor. Maybe it's going to run out of food. Maybe it's going to run out of water, disease, space. But something is going to keep it from growing forever. It flattens out. It reaches equilibrium. Limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. What will be the human carrying capacity? What will our number be? We will not hit that number until we first of all hit that first limiting factor. Carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals and species that an environment can support and maintain. If a population gets bigger than the carrying capacity, that means some individuals are left without resources. For example, if water ends up being the limiting factor for humans, then as the population continues to grow, we have less water per person. And the people who are less fit for the environment will be the first ones to die off. Exponential growth occurs when species move around to new areas with plenty of food, plenty of space. The population picks back up. So what would happen, for example, if water is our limiting factor, but then one day we colonize another planet with a lot of water? Since water is what we ran out of, and we find plenty of it, then our population will pick back up again. We will go from the S curve back to a J curve. So what determines the carrying capacity? Limiting factors. And don't forget, you only need to hit one limiting factor. Whichever one you hit first will stop that growth from being exponential and turn it into logistical. The J curve will become an S curve. So what's the carrying capacity here in this picture? Don't forget, the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that you can have in an area because you ran out of something, or you hit a limiting factor. In this case, the top of the S curve is 10,000. So the population is 10,000. The carrying capacity is 10,000 in this picture. When you do hit the carrying capacity, or you could say equilibrium, it's not going to be a perfect flat line. So if we go back to, let's say, water for humans, possibly water, and we run out of water, the population will continue to rise above the carrying capacity for a little while. And what would happen is people would start dying who are not adapt for that particular environment. And when they die, they will have, the death rates will be so high it will go below the carrying capacity. And all of a sudden we'll start seeing, hey, we have more water per person now, so the population will go back up. But it will eventually reach an average. It will reach equilibrium, and that number will be the carrying capacity. Here's a projection for humans that at the current rate of growth for humans, by the year 2050, we'll have 9.1 billion people. We will only hit that number if we don't hit a limiting factor. So why is the population growing so fast for humans? Well, it's because we have right now plenty of food, plenty of water. Disease is not that big of a burden, although disease does kill some members of our population. It's not affecting the majority, which is why the population is growing. We have medicine, clean water, better nutrition. So will we hit that large number by the year 2050? Time will tell. Will we hit that limiting factor before then? What about population density? Well, population density is basically the number of organisms in a given area. As you can see in the pictures here on the left-hand side, the fish are real close together, so we have high population density. They don't have a lot of room to move around. But on the right-hand side, they have more room to move around, so they are less dense on the right-hand side. There are two types. The first one is density independent. Independent affects all populations regardless of the size. For example, it doesn't matter how many fish you have in that pond. It doesn't matter if it's a big pond, a little pond, a lot of fish or little fish. They can still have a flood. They could still be in a drought. There could still be a fire beside the pond. There could be an earthquake. It doesn't matter how big the population is. Those things could still happen. It's density independent. The opposite of it, density independent, is density dependent. In other words, these things that could happen are dependent upon the size of the population. For example, the bigger the population, the more likely you would be able to compete for food. Right? Competition goes up. The bigger the population, the less shelter you have. The bigger the population, more likely you will have predators at some point to move into the area, more parasites, more disease. So the size is dependent upon those things. For example, if the predators increase in that area, then the population in that area will probably go down. It's dependence, density dependent. Does the population size decrease at the carrying capacity? And how can you tell? Here's an example of number one of scenario. A prairie in Morgan Hill is home to a species of rabbits. The prairie has a lot of grass, and the rabbits don't normally have to compete with any other organisms for food. But a group of scientists want to do an experiment on population growth, and they introduce a new closely related species of rabbit into the prairie. The two rabbit species are now competing for food. What will the growth model look like for the original population of rabbits that inhabited the prairie first? Well, originally they had a lot of food, a lot of water, a lot of space, so they were in a J-curve, exponential curve. But when the scientists introduced more rabbits into the area, now competition went up. They don't have as much room, as much food, or as much water, so they start competing. And whichever they run out of first, whichever limiting factor they hit first, their J-curve will turn into an S-curve at that point. Here's another example. We have an island in the Caribbean that has unlimited supply of fruits and vegetables and space for miles. A ship passes by with a bunch of monkeys, and the monkeys get on the island. What would it look like for them with unlimited space and food? Well, the monkeys will have plenty to eat, plenty to drink, a lot of space. Their population is going to go up like a J-curve, exponential.